In 1990, one of his paintings sold at auction for $82.5 million. It set a record. The buyer paid more for that single canvas than most countries spend on their entire national art collections in a year. The painter who made it had sold exactly one painting in his entire lifetime, for the equivalent of a few weeks' groceries. His name was Vincent van Gogh. Born in 1853 in a small village in the Netherlands, the son of a Protestant pastor. He was a quiet, serious child who spent most of his time alone, wandering the countryside and observing things most people walked past without noticing. Nobody watching him then would have guessed he was going to change the history of art. Nobody watching him for most of his adult life would have guessed it either. At 16, his uncle got him a job at an art dealership. For several years, he worked in the firm's offices in The Hague, London, and Paris. He became deeply knowledgeable about art. He loved it, studied it, wrote letters about it constantly, but he was a disaster as a salesman. He was fired in 1876, having told too many customers that the paintings they wanted to buy weren't actually worth buying. What followed was nearly a decade of failed attempts to find his place in the world. He worked briefly as a school teacher, then a bookseller. Then he went to the coal mining region of Belgium and became a lay preacher, living among the poorest workers he could find, giving away his own possessions, sleeping on floors. The church dismissed him for being too extreme in his devotion. He was 25 years old with nothing to show for it. In 1880, at age 27, Van Gogh made a decision. He would become an artist. He had no formal training, no money, no connections in the art world. He had already failed at everything else he had tried. He picked up a pencil and started drawing the same way he had always approached things, with total, almost reckless commitment. His early work was dark and heavy. Paintings of peasants and miners, the same people he had lived among in Belgium. Somber colors, thick shadows. The most famous of them, The Potato Eaters, shows a family eating their meager meal under a dim oil lamp. He was largely self-taught, receiving only about 4 months of formal art training in his entire life. In 1886, he moved to Paris to live with his younger brother Theo, who worked as an art dealer. Paris changed everything. For the first time, Van Gogh encountered the Impressionists, painters who used light and color in ways he had never seen before. He tried to copy their techniques. He couldn't quite match them, so instead, he developed something entirely his own. His palette transformed. The dark browns and grays of his Dutch period gave way to vibrant yellows, electric blues, and burning oranges. He painted faster, more urgently, as if he was trying to capture something that might disappear before he could get it onto the canvas. In 1888, he left Paris for the south of France. He rented a small house in the town of Arles, painted it yellow, and dreamed of turning it into an artist's colony where creative minds could work together. He wrote to his friend Paul Gauguin, begging him to come. Theo offered to pay Gauguin's expenses. Gauguin eventually agreed. While waiting for Gauguin to arrive, Van Gogh painted furiously. The Sunflowers series, Café Terrace at Night, The Bedroom. Some of these canvases were completed in a single day. The urgency in his brushstrokes is visible even now, all these decades later. Gauguin arrived in October 1888. The two men worked together for about 2 months. They also argued constantly about art, about technique, about everything. Van Gogh described their arguments as electric. Gauguin described threats of violence. On the night of December 23rd, after a particularly severe argument, Gauguin left the house and spent the night at a hotel. Van Gogh was alone. What happened next remains debated even today. At some point that night, he cut off part of his own earlobe with a razor. Note that some historians have even suggested Gauguin may have been involved in the injury, though that theory has never been proven. He wrapped what he had cut off in paper and delivered it to a woman at a nearby brothel with the instruction to keep it carefully. Police found him collapsed in his room. He was hospitalized. Theo arrived on Christmas Day to find his brother pale, weak, and confused. Gauguin left Arles immediately and never returned. After several more episodes, the people of Arles had had enough. Local residents signed a petition demanding he be confined. The man who had come to the south of France to build an artist's community was being expelled by the very town he had painted with such love. Van Gogh checked himself into a mental asylum in Saint-Remy in May 1889. Voluntarily. He knew he needed help. His room had a small window overlooking a wheat field and a walled garden. The doctors let him paint. What he produced during his time at the asylum was extraordinary. The Starry Night, Irises, a series of paintings so alive with movement and color that they barely look like they belong to the same century as the art hanging in the salons of Paris. He was, by most accounts, going through some of the worst periods of his life. He was also producing his greatest work. Throughout all of it, he wrote letters. Nearly 800 of them over his lifetime, most to Theo. They are extraordinary documents. Painfully honest about his failures, his loneliness, his fear that his work meant nothing. In one letter, he wrote that he felt a fire within him that he was not allowed to let go out, even when everything around him was falling apart. In May 1890, Van Gogh was discharged from the asylum. He moved to a small town north of Paris called Auvers-sur-Oise to be closer to Theo. He seemed, by some accounts, more stable than he had been in years. He was painting every day, writing hopeful letters. Then, on July 27, 1890, something happened in a wheat field outside Auvers. Van Gogh was found that evening staggering back to the inn where he was staying with a gunshot wound in his chest. He told the innkeeper he had shot himself. The gun was never found. The art supplies he had supposedly taken to the field were never found either. Some historians believe he may have been accidentally shot by local boys and covered for them. The truth remains uncertain. Theo rushed from Paris. He sat by his brother's bedside through the night. Vincent van Gogh died on July 29, 1890. He was 37 years old. His last words to Theo were simple. He said the sadness will last forever. The funeral was attended by a handful of friends and fellow artists. The room was lined with his paintings and covered in sunflowers, the flower he had painted over and over in his most hopeful months. He had sold one painting in his lifetime, The Red Vineyard, for 400 francs 7 months before his death. 6 months after Vincent died, Theo collapsed. He died in January 1891, having never recovered from his grief. Everything now rested with Theo's widow, Johanna, a young Dutch woman in her 20s, left with a baby, a small apartment, and several hundred of Vincent's paintings that almost nobody wanted. Johanna spent the rest of her life making sure the world knew who Vincent van Gogh was. She organized exhibitions. She published his letters. She refused offers to sell the collection for almost nothing. Without her, there is a real chance Van Gogh's work would have disappeared entirely, the same way so many of his early paintings did. His own mother reportedly threw out crates of his work after his death, thinking it worthless. Today, the Starry Night hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It may be the most recognized painting in the world. The Sunflower series regularly fetches prices that would have kept Van Gogh fed and painting for the rest of a very long life. His portrait of Dr. Gachet sold in 1990 for $82 million. He spent 10 years painting with everything he had, in poverty, in poor health, largely alone, producing over 900 paintings and more than 1,000 drawings. He sold one of them. And the world spent the century after his death trying to figure out what to do with a talent that large, arriving in a life that small, burning that fast, and ending that quietly in a wheat field outside a small French town on a summer afternoon.